Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to this last session. It shows a certain amount of staying power, I would venture to suggest. One of the good things about being in the chair is that you don't have to reveal how little you know compared to the people who are the experts on the panel. And so with that, let me just introduce the panel very, very briefly. We have Dale Cottrell right at the end there, who's the Regional Managing Director of Bain & Company. We have John Wilson, who's a long-time member of the staff of the World Bank. We have Julia Tijaja, who is a colleague of mine at the Fung Global Institute. And we have Anders Karlberg, who's the President, Customer Order and Logistics, Integrated Business Services of Huawei Technologies. So we're going to, today what we really want to discuss, we want to dig a little deeper than the last panel, but clearly it's quite related, and ask questions about trade costs, essentially about trade costs, looking at this whole issue through the prism of trade costs, which is why we've called the session Enabling Trade. Of course, broadly speaking, there are the costs that are associated with infrastructural challenges, physical infrastructure, human capital. They do have a policy angle to them. And then there's the whole area of policy, which I think will probably be the main focus of our discussion, but not exclusively so. And what we are trying to get a handle on is how policy feeds into a mixture of what is essential and necessary from a public policy perspective and what is a gratuitous addition of unnecessary costs. And so if you look at the situation with respect to the evolution of trade policy, by and large, although with some notable exceptions, tariffs are no longer much of the story. We can easily argue that it's good to get rid of tariffs. That puts public policy front and center, and particularly issues like standards and other kinds of administrative interventions. And what we're really thinking about here is how do these, we can't say you want to get rid of them. You can only really say that you want to manage them. And so I think what we're really trying to get at here is, what's their intent? Are they sensible interventions from the perspective of business, bearing in mind what the public policy objectives, at least putatively, are? And then I think even more importantly on the ground, and this is something that will be verified or otherwise by the panel, it's very much a question of how they're designed and how they are administered. And that's where the rub comes. And I think we'll be talking quite a bit about that. But before that, John Wilson is going to kick off, and I think John is going to talk about, if I'm not mistaken, he's going to talk about some of the elements of the work of the World Bank, which has been much more broadly based than only policy in terms of trade costs. But I hope you'll address policy as well. But I think you're going to have something to say about infrastructure and so on. So we'll start with you, John, and I'm going to ask the panelists to try to stick to 10 minutes because then we'll have plenty of time for interaction, for discussion. So, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. And really a pleasure to be in Hong Kong again. I remember the first time that I came to Hong Kong that in 1980, I thought it was the most wonderful and vibrant city I had ever seen, and that's really carried forward to this day. Even now working from New York, coming to Hong Kong is a great, great pleasure. And I want to thank the Fung Global Institute and Patrick for the invitation. What I'd like to do in my brief remarks is to set the issue of trade transaction costs within the context of the current very fragile global economic recovery coming out of the 2008 global recession. And what I would argue to you is that we have the most important opportunity that we've had since the dawn of industrialization to really address trade transaction costs, to lower those costs, to facilitate trade in an era when I believe that these trade transaction costs and their continuance is really the most important threat to the global economy and the reigniting global trade that we have today. And I'll offer some examples, from our work at the World Bank to try to highlight that point. The key drivers of global recovery is really anchored in the engine of global trade. We've heard that today. We know that that's true. Much of the engine of global trade is being restarted in South-South trade, trade between developing countries, including those in Asia. Over the past 8 years, the OECD share of global imports has declined from 69 to 59%. And an example from China, China's import share has increased from 8 to 14%. So out of the crisis with recovery, a very fundamental and important part of reigniting global trade is anchored in developing countries, including those in Asia, and in particular countries like China, and the agenda to lower trade transaction costs in particular is an important one for countries like China to undertake in a very admittedly volatile and challenging rebalancing and restructuring, but with great opportunity to lower trade transaction costs and to expand opportunities in global value chains. Well, what are trade costs? There are basically two sets of them. One is anchored in issues such as proximity to a trading partner, questions of distance from a trading partner, factors such as common languages and other issues. And there are also these policy-based trade transaction costs. And I'll mention a couple of the key areas of them. They're anchored in inefficient customs regimes. They're anchored in technical and regulatory barriers that are discriminatory or are not aligned with international norms. And from our work at the World Bank, even though the debate rages on as to whether one should address barriers related to infrastructure, that these are the most binding type of constraints that tend to raise trade transaction costs, and you have others that argue that these regulatory and policy-based barriers are more important. Much of our work seems to indicate, at least from a global perspective, that these regulatory, policy-based trade transaction costs are the most costly. It's not to say that infrastructure isn't important, and you really have to decompose this to the country level, but these policy-based obstacles to trade in trade transaction costs are very serious ones. Well, what do we know about these trade transaction costs? How binding are they? We have data at the World Bank. We've looked at global data sets. We've done country data sets. Let me offer two examples from the sort of global picture. We did a report a couple of years ago, one of the first that really asked the question, how would trade change along various dimensions of trade facilitation if we were to raise capacity or lower trade transaction costs? We looked at the diffusion of IT and telecom in trade transactions. We looked at customs and border regimes. We looked at inefficient service sector infrastructure. And we estimated about a $377 billion gain to trade associated with raising capacity or reforming the globe halfway to the global average. So we know from a sort of global standpoint that these barriers are potentially, with their reduction in trade transaction costs, very valuable. And in particular, very valuable in today's trading environment. We've also looked at this question of hard versus soft infrastructure, again, in a global sort of database picture. And to look at China out of that analysis that we looked at, we estimated that if China were to improve its physical infrastructure halfway to the level of Malaysia, which was our top performer in our data set, China could increase its exports by 10%, which is about a 9% reduction in tariffs faced by Chinese exporters. We've also looked at questions of regulatory transparency through this database, and we estimated that China's exports could increase by 4% if it reformed its business regulation and regulatory structures related to customs. We've also looked at these issues of standards and technical barriers to trade. And again, I'll give you an example from China. If you look at the regulatory environment as it relates to trade transaction costs, we're looking at a world that is continues to regulate nationally, even when there are international norms that could be adopted in regulation, whether that's telecom and IT, or in this case that we looked at very recently, China's food safety standards. About 15% of China's food safety standards are harmonized to international norms. And we estimated that if China, one additional internationally harmonized food safety standard in China could increase Chinese exports by close to $190 million. Now remember, you might think, well, that's a small number, but it's a classic win-win. It's a win for China's exports, and it's a win for global consumers. And so I guess what I would suggest is that the agenda in trade transaction costs is largely, although not exclusively, a policy and regulatory-based agenda. That we know that there are significant gains to lowering trade transaction costs, and there are policy tools and levers to address this. There's been a lot of talk about the WTO and the multilateral system. Clearly that is extremely important. But there's also a unilateral step, and we at the bank see that in our increased demand for project lending in these areas of regulatory reform, customs harmonization, standards harmonization. So in the discussion of the trade agenda, let's not forget the engine of unilateral reform and what a country can do in its own interest to reform, to lower trade transaction costs, and facilitate further engagement in these global value chains. Let me just end with a quick advertisement. We actually have been working with the OECD WTO Trade and Value Add database. We have a new report that we're going to be coming out with, we hope, in mid-January, where we looked at trade and value add in several sectors and mapped that into transport infrastructure. So we're trying to, these sort of new models that was discussed in the last panel, to try to get at this question of can we say something about these barriers in trade facilitation, whether they're regulatory or infrastructure related, that would also be informed by how a country's performance within a global value chain would change associated with improving or deregulating or investing in infrastructure. So it's an exciting agenda. There's a very large and important policy debate that can be informed, we hope, by analysis, and it's an exciting and interesting field, I think.
Thanks very much, John. You certainly adduced a good amount of evidence that we are dealing with something that's a real problem. There is one point, of course, that when you think about this in terms of global value chains, if you're somewhere upstream on the value chain and you add unnecessary costs, every time that the product on which those costs were added crossed the next frontier, those costs are magnified. So it actually becomes a more acute problem for internationalized production. But the one thing I wanted to ask you, or put you on the spot, World Bank, has the World Bank taken a view of how much of what you're dealing with in the area of unnecessary policy-induced costs to doing business, mostly related to regulatory, administrative thing, is a function of a lack of capacity capability in government, and how much of it is to do with good, healthy, rent-seeking, profiteering governance questions?
That you probably would get more than one answer to that, depending upon what World Bank official we're speaking on it.
Informal, of course.
But yes, you know, I don't think there's it really depends. The details at the country level, at the province level, at the local level, it really matters a great deal. And if you look at our project portfolio around the world in trade-related lending, and we have that data available if anyone is interested, it's really a quite now fairly robust data set. You will see a wide variety, again, of countries that are interested in borrowing from the World Bank in their own interest to address these questions, and they span a fairly wide range.
That would suggest capacity capability and not ill intent. Okay, that was as close as we get to a clear answer from the World Bank. Thanks, John. I didn't really want to put you on the spot, just teasing. Dale Cottrell, one of the reasons we invited Bain onto this panel was because of the work that WEF, World Economic Forum, and Bain have been doing. You know, there's also the APEC, ABAC work that I'm familiar with, but Bain and the World Economic Forum have been doing some pretty systematic analysis involving also the World Bank, trying to really get to the bottom of some of these issues and trying to at least get a handle on that. So Dale, quite apart from what you have to say about the issues at hand, it would be quite interesting to know what this is and how accessible it is and so on.
Thanks, Patrick, and it's great to be here and be part of the panel, so thank you, and thanks to the Full Institute. I've recently relocated from Australia, you can probably tell by my broad Australian accent, here to Hong Kong, so I call Hong Kong home now for us, after the last 4 months. It's great to be sort of here in the heart of Asia. And as a consulting firm, we pride ourselves on working with clients to deliver bottom line results. And when we talk about our clients and what their agenda is, it's all about growth. It's about shareholder value. And if you step back from the firm level to the macro level, trade is just so important to igniting growth going forward. So we're quite excited to be doing work in and around the trade agenda. It was interesting, Stanley Fischer this morning quoting Keynes saying, you know, ideas are really at the heart of what we need. And I guess today I'd like to put some fresh ideas on the table around this. The enabling trade reports that we've been producing that I'll talk to, Patrick, with the World Bank, in collaboration with the World Bank and WEF, are the result of quite a lot of work, analytical work, very data-driven, on, you know, what are the root causes for trade not being at its full potential, what's the upside around that quantified, and actually, more importantly, what are the actions we can take? So I'm going to focus a little bit more today on the practical actions that can be taken. There are versions of the report you can take away and read later on, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the report itself today. I'm going to focus more on, so what does it all mean? Last year we really focused on setting the scene, and this year it's been more around deep dives, a whole bunch of case studies with real live situations across multiple industries, multiple countries, sizing the prize and thinking about the actions. We're currently putting some final touches to a report which goes deeper on food and auto, so going a lot deeper in a couple of industries to draw out. And the report has been one of the foundations of the Doha negotiations this week. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out overall, but as a set of sub-themes. That's enough context. I guess the big issue I'd like to put on the table today is I think there's actually some really uncommon insights coming out of this work. And I think in general, if you look beyond this room, they're very uncommon insights. I think for many people in this room, you'd say, I'm already there. But if you look at why people haven't acted on some of these insights that I'll talk about today, it's because they haven't seen them yet. Stuart Gulliver this morning, we all heard him talk about tankers and taxis. So I've been living in Hong Kong for 4 months. I've asked taxi drivers, colleagues, clients, what causes the pollution on a bad day? Taxi drivers say it's the motor vehicles in Hong Kong. That was really interesting for me. That was an uncommon insight that tankers actually a bigger proportion of the pollution here than taxis. I know there's other factors as well, but that was sort of an uncommon insight. It sort of makes sense once you hear that. I guess the uncommon insight here is to unlock the next value of trade growth going forward. Focusing on eliminating or reducing supply chain barriers is going to have a much more significant impact than further tariff reduction. So from tariff reduction to supply chain barriers going forward. And that's what's going to drive the microeconomic foundations, getting those right in the economy. It's going to drive productivity and competitiveness. So what are the findings? Tariff reduction has historically been the key area of focus around trade outcomes. And we believe that the further reductions in tariffs are actually dwarfed by the benefits associated with reducing or eliminating supply chain barriers. Now, they're not easy to get, but the value is really high. And these barriers are often hidden. If you look at it from a firm perspective, what many firms do, and I'm sure Enders will talk a bit about this, but inventory. So firms cover up these issues of not being able to deliver in time and on full by carrying a lot of inventory. So you don't necessarily see these pain points in the supply chain directly. Indirectly, they fall through to financial statements as a cost of carrying that inventory, etc. What is the size of the prize? We believe there's a prize here of up to 5% growth in GDP, 15% trade increase, and a significant multiplication factor in terms of what the benefit you'd get from tariff reductions. And the reason that the benefits are so high is that we're talking about eliminating wastage of resources rather than reallocating resources. And the benefits are in lower costs and higher job growth. In quantifying the benefits, we've quantified potentially another 70 to 80 million jobs globally from getting this right. The size of the prize has been validated through many case studies. The US International Trade Commission did the modelling work to validate the size of the prize. And it was a conservative estimate in that if you assumed, I'll talk about the different levers, but only 2 or 4 levers, you got an uplift and you've only got half the uplift that's possible, you get that size of prize. Now, I'd argue even if the size of prize was half that, it's worth going after. It's a big number. So what are the barriers? We came up with four classes of barrier, and John talked about some of these just a moment ago. The first one's market access. So this is quotas, import fees, local content, those sorts of things. The second one's border administration. And many of us who've worked in a long supply chain see this day to day. Customs administration, import-export procedures. Victor raised the question in the earlier session about what's the impact of e-commerce. And automating a bunch of these procedures can take out a lot of those friction costs. Telecom and transport infrastructure. We think a lot about transport infrastructure, ports, roads, rail, but telecoms infrastructure as well. The softer infrastructure is really important. And the business environment, we just heard in the earlier session that there can be an 8 to 15% increase in cost in India by moving products 700 kilometres to a port. That's very, very live example of, the business environment issues that you have to face. So what do we need to do to tackle these issues? If there's a big prize and there's a bunch of issues, what can we do about it? And I think overall we need a few things. One is it's got to be a public-private partnership. It has to be a public-private partnership because the private sector can see the pain points, but they don't control the pain points. The government it puts in place regulation, but they can't necessarily see the the pain points, and they can't quantify which ones are the biggest to go after. So you need both sides of the coin. The second thing we need to do is think supply chain, end-to-end supply chain, and that's product, services, and all the processes that wrap around that. And these days, with supply chains being international, fragmented, it's actually harder than it used to be. And thirdly, we need to do the classic things that we should always do when we're trying to solve a big problem, which is do a fact-based diagnostic, work out what the problems are, go back to the root causes, and focus the solutions on where the most money is. Follow the Pareto chart. And I guess that's what I'm talking about overall is a Pareto chart, from tariffs to supply chain barriers here. But even within supply chain barriers, there are some that'll be worth a lot more than others. And it's going to vary by industry because each industry's supply chain is quite different. If you've got a perishable supply chain versus not, if you're an international versus not, depending on which countries you're going through, etc. What does it mean for governments and what does it mean for the private sector within that? So for governments, it's really important to set up a single agency to manage this. The analogy here is building a bridge. So once you decide where you're going to build a bridge, so let's assume we're going to go after supply chain barriers, what's the first thing you do? You get a design. You work out what you're going to do. What do you do next? You appoint a project manager. Now, why do you appoint a project manager? Why do we all appoint project managers in our own organisations to do anything that's tough? Because it's usually cross-functional. You need someone who can sit outside the line and manage this. Well, in government, it's the same thing. We're talking about multiple agencies, multiple departments with these who are managing and putting in place, in many parts, the regulation around these supply chain barriers. We need data and feedback loops. We've got to recognise the interests of SMEs as part of this. This is not just a big corporate issue. This is small businesses. We ultimately need international cooperation. We need a conversion of many of our paper-based systems to electronic systems. And finally, we need to recognise that there's a tipping point here. Any one individual supply chain barrier that gets eliminated may not swing trade. But if you put enough of them in place, they will cause firms to decide to source from another country, to relocate manufacturing in another place. And it won't be the single factor. So when a corporate is pulling together a business case, they're looking at all of these issues they're not just looking at the labour cost arbitrage of country A to country B. There's all these other costs. I'm sure Anders will talk a bit more about that. So what do you do if you're a corporation? Well, I think if you're a large business, many of our clients, it's think about public-private partnerships. Many of them do this. Resources industry is very good at thinking about this before they'll unlock a major opportunity. Focus on the end-to-end supply chain and take the lead in what corporates are good at doing, which is identifying the size of the prize, identifying what the pain points are, getting back to root causes, sequencing, prioritising, developing a roadmap. And so when you're actually talking to government, you're saying, hey, there's a big prize here if we get this right, but it's going to require some difficult decisions. And you may want to think about that on your own if you're a large business or through an industry association, because many of these are industry supply chain solutions that we need. And finally, I'd say, you might sound like this is a plug for Bain, but it's not. I think you need an honest broker. You need somebody, whether it's internal or external, who can bring the brutal facts to the table and keep the discussions objective around the facts so you can make the decisions that are needed. That's not always external, that can be internal. If that project manager I talked about sitting over this public-private partnership is someone who's very fact-based and a real driver, they can do this as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dale. All this work that you've been describing is really looking at mostly at developing countries, emerging economies. And in that context, you observe that tariffs are not very important. There's just one thing that I would like to point out for food supply chains and labor-intensive manufacturing supply chains. There's massive tariff escalation still in a number of the major markets. So when we're thinking about trade costs and the ease of actually doing business, sometimes that's overlooked. So if you produce coffee and you export the raw coffee to Europe, it'll go in at 0 tariff. If you dry it and husk it, it'll attract a positive number. If you roast it, an even bigger one. If you grind it, an even bigger one. If you make instant coffee, an even bigger one. You can see what that does to supply chains, to value added. So I think we shouldn't completely ignore, the only point I want to make is I don't think we should completely ignore tariffs as a problem in international trade.
I agree. I think this is actually in addition to. In the end, it's not, except for, I think this is, we still need to focus on tariffs, but there's a massive prize on eliminating this.
I'm not suggesting.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that I think I tend to do this, be rather glib about saying our tariffs is yesterday's news. Yes and no. Now, Julia, my colleague Julia, who keeps me honest, or tries to keep me honest in the Fung Global Institute, is actually a specialist on global value chain. She's recently wrote her doctoral thesis on the supply chain for cassava. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the things that she has found in her own work and some work we've been doing with respect to, basically, I guess it's to the design and implementation of some of these measures. Julia.
Thanks, Patrick. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So I think I'm going to keep my presentation short because I think a lot of the good points has been mentioned by this other panelists on this session as well as in the previous session. But what I would really like to highlight today is not just to broadly frame how policy actually could affect trade costs, but also peppering it with real examples from some of the work that we have done at the Fung Global Institute, also from based on previous work that we've done as well. Well, as we already heard from the other panelists, policy have real impact on the supply chains. That impact might come from the policy intent. That's probably something that's a bit more tricky for us to, that's more difficult to discuss, but also from the policy design, interpretation, and also administration as well. And as Patrick already highlighted, that the impact of policy on global supply chains is actually amplified because you have now different components of the products in a single supply chain crossing multiple countries with the production process that's done by multiple firms. So the impact of policy actually amplified. So how does policy affect the supply chains? It could be done in a number of ways. First of all, really it's a matter of the configuration of supply chains. In an environment where the costs related to policy is too high, the lead firms of the global value chain might decide to allocate part of the activities elsewhere in the place where the cost is not as high. It will also affect the participation of firms. I mean, what kind of firms actually end up participating in the supply chains? If there is economies of scale in complying or in meeting with policy requirements, then you might have a very different spectrum of participation in the supply chains. Policy will also affect the internal governance of supply chains, and with this we refer to how the supply chains actually operate. Just to give you a concrete example, in some of the supply chains where standards compliance is more stringent, the lead firms might have to take a greater responsibilities making sure the traceability of standard compliance along the supply chains. And as such, it might either have a more vertically integrated supply chains, or even if it's not, if it still organizes supply chains on an arm's length or in a more modular basis, it might actually impose a more stringent risk management requirements on all of their input suppliers. And then, of course, this then brings us to the question of who would bear the costs of actually complying with the different standards. Last but not least, policy will also affect the potential for firms in the supply chains to upgrade or to innovate and hence capturing a greater share of the supply chains. Now, what's interesting about the policy-driven trade costs is that policy intent aside, this is really an area where there is a greatest alignment between policymakers and business. Because what we have now, when you have them, policy is unnecessarily actually increasing trade costs. There is a mutual interest among different stakeholders to reduce this, to reduce the deadweight loss, with greater benefits not only for the firms, but also for the consumers in along the supply chains. Just to give you an example, the specific policy-based trade costs I would like to talk about is standards. This is an area that we've been focusing quite a bit in our work at the global value chains. We've been working with different corporate partners across different sectors, from low technology manufacturing, high technology manufacturing, up to the food supply chains as well. So we won't mention names, just to give you some of the real examples of how trade costs could be created by policies. In one of the markets, sometimes the government might require that standard compliance be certified by designated authorities. And in doing so, then it really depends on whether these designated authorities actually have the capacity to deal efficiently with the trade flows for that particular products. It is not uncommon to actually find long queues, long time delays, just to make sure that the product testing can be done on the specific consignment that you're doing. So these imply actually real costs, real trade costs to the firm. The other example is policy uncertainties. So this is not about the way the policy is being designed, but perhaps the interpretation of the policy. If you are importing the same intermediate inputs through different ports, and you find that the exact same products actually interpreted as different products under different product classification, with implication on the level of tariff that you have to pay, these create massive uncertainties for business in their products, and actually that cost will be amplified along the supply chains that you have across the different countries. I'd like to start my presentation by mentioning it's an important country in Asia that I have particular affinity to, and that's the country is Indonesia, where I come from. And I think it's a country that I would like to stay optimistic. I think it's a country that actually want to get things done right, and it is in the process still of getting things done right. It wants to climb up the value chains. I think Hubert in the last session mentioned something about why is it governments, when they talk about global value chains now, they talk about capturing the gains. I think the terms that we hear more these days is possibly not so much about capturing the gains, but actually about climbing up the global value chains. They simply want to capture a greater share from their participation in the global value chains. They don't want to just be involved, if you like, in the low value added activities. So Indonesia has this aspiration, and it has, if you like, all the right ingredients in terms of resources, in natural resources, in terms of competitive labor costs, domestic market size. But sometimes it's not easy to translate that policy objectives into policy design and implementation. Just to give you an example, very quick example, I want to highlight the geothermal industry in Indonesia. Indonesia has serious energy deficit. We are still a net producer of oil and gas. No, we are a net importer of oil now, net producer of gas, but we have significant shortfall in terms of energy supply. And this is going to be increasingly become an issue as the country develops further. At the same time, we are sitting on the biggest reserve of geothermal in the world. I think we have about 40% of the world geothermal reserves. Only 4% of this 40% is currently being developed. And one of the biggest policy barriers is that at the moment, the geothermal reserves are actually sitting in areas where being recognized as forest conservation areas. So these are the kind of things under the forestry bill. So these are the kind of things where a good policy objectives might face barrier in terms of coordination, policy coordination across different ministries. I guess is my time like no? Okay, and then okay. And I guess I want to close this by saying last month, I think, I went for the field work to Indonesia, spoke to one of our corporate partners, and I was told something that really catch my attention, and that is that this is from a company, and basically the company says that these days, as a firm, we can no longer offer product-specific goods. What we need to offer is a solution. You can't just focus on the product-specific thing, and I think this is actually the same problems that policymakers are facing. You can't just focus on specific product, specific industry, while failing to actually looking at it from the bigger picture. You need to think about it in a more holistic sense. Yes, it will require something that's more specific in the long term in terms of your policy design and intervention, but you should not just see look at it from a very narrow perspective, because then you might just lose the big picture. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julia. Do you want to cut the forest down or preserve the? I mean, what you want to do there? Do you want to cut the forest down to extract the energy?
No, I think they need to come with a solution to that. It's not easy, but I think there must be a way out.
Good FGI answer. There's always a way. Now we have Anders here, who has the distinction amongst all of us of actually working on the coalface, on the front line with Huawei. Do you get it? Huawei. So he's going to tell us a bit about the company, and he's going to tell us a bit about some of the issues and challenges that the company faces in this complex of policies.
Sure. Thank you, Patrick, and thanks for being here also. So I'm Anders Karlborg. I'm responsible for the global supply chain for Huawei, and I will give you a few minutes about Huawei, who we are. I'm not sure if anybody heard about Huawei or not, but we are today one of the world's leading ICT solutions provider. We are a Fortune 500 company. We have 3 different business groups. We have the carrier, the traditional one. We have the enterprise, a new business group for us. And we have the devices. For the carriers, we are leading in the world today, one of the leading company together with Ericsson. And for our devices, the mobile phones, we are number 3 in the world for smartphones today. But we don't market ourselves that good, so we are a big company. We are $40 billion company with 70% of the revenue outside China. We are a Chinese private company, 150,000 employees, and we are more or less supplying to 50 or 45 of the 50 biggest operators in the world today. So we are a truly global company today. Myself, been in Huawei for 5 years, started off with revenue around $20 billion, and we now more double it in 5 years. Of course, that put a lot of pressure on me as supply chain president and how to supply all those products. So starting up 5 years ago, we had 1 factory supplying the whole world in China. Of course, the customer was not happy at all with our performance, our lead time, and everything. We could not meet the demand. So we need to establish a global supply chain. And of course, one of the big challenges for us is to understand where to do it and how to do it. And of course, as Dale said before, it's a lot of cost. It's financial flow, the legal flow, and the trade barriers also when you're establishing a supply chain. But our ultimate goal is, of course, to meet the customer demand to the cost we need to pay for it, of course. But we are, as a Huawei company, we are actively involved in reducing the supply chain barriers by establishing efficient communication network in countries like Africa, and our infrastructure is not the best place today. We also, of course, enhancing the communication service in mature regions like Europe and other regions. We are also affected by most of the typical supply chain barriers that push us to adopt certain risk management tactics, as everybody mentioned before here also. The most negative effect for us today is, as Dale mentioned also, is to the risk we're facing by have a lot of inventory, and sometimes in wrong places. But not only the inventory, is if our customer don't use the inventory, it will be a lot of waste, and we jeopardizing the whole ecological network also. So today we are forced to implement our warehouses, our production centers in countries where we maybe not want to have inventory because it's so expensive, but we need to do that to balance the uncertainty from our customers. So we try to build our supply chain on 3 different principles when it comes to trade. We call it adopt, and influence, and accept. Adopt is when we are really adapting to the local environment and really build a truly local supply chain in countries where we need to do it. And typical example of that is part of the countries in South America, Brazil, for example. We also have, second one is the influence, where we are part of different forums and try to influence the different regulators in different countries and how to have a smoother way into the countries. And the third one is to accept the barriers, more or less. We can do nothing about it. We need to build a big inventory in wrong places to meet the customer demand. But all in all, we need, of course, to look at the total cost for the whole supply chain and see, is it worth establishing a manufacturing facility or an inventory facility or a hub facility? So our strategy is clear, to try to move forward into standardization of the product and do configuration, postponement of supply chain very close to our customers to avoid this risk of wrong inventory, and maybe we need to ship back to China if it's possible. So reuse of the product, meet the customer demand, and look at the overall cost for us is critical. And I don't think it's only the trade barrier which is hindering us or stopping us. It's also the whole risk management. When you're putting up a supply chain, you look at the trade barriers, look at the cost, but you also look at the risk. We just did a study with the World Economic Forum like 6 months ago on risk management and how to balance the cost in relation to the risk, also to make sure you can always deliver to your customer. So our ultimate goal is, of course, to have a happy customer. And today we are doing pretty good, but we are having too high cost. The other aspects which somebody mentioned before is also the uncertainty of different import to different countries. 1 week you can have 3 days clearance for some product, and the other week it's up to 20 days without anybody knowing why. And we have the situation in part of the world today when we need to understand how can we balance this and how can we understand what's going on. And that's kind of personal relationship to understand what's going on here also. So to be a supply chain, when I'm running the supply chain now, you need to have an organization who are localized, globalized, to understand the trade and the impact of the supply chain. And that's a challenge, but it's good for us also. So I think we will have a good discussion later, and I'm willing to take a lot of questions about the practical world of supply chain. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anders. Somebody told me that in a few years' time, Huawei is going to leave Samsung and Apple in the dust. Would you like to?
So Huawei has been, I'll take the political standpoint, right? Huawei has been growing tremendously good over the last, we started our company 20 years ago, and we are number 1 in the infrastructure and number 3 in the smartphones. Our ambition is not to be number 1 in smartphones, but today we are top 3, and of course, everybody needs to have a downturn sometimes, and we are there, we are ready for it.
Okay. One thing I'd like to, just before we open it up, just very briefly, something that I think is missing, and I wonder if you have any kind of take on this. We've been looking at individual supply chains, individual global value chains, and we've been kind of getting cost numbers. There's one thing that you see pretty consistently, which is that the vast bulk of the value is invisible, the services. 60, 70, 80%. Now, I don't think we understand nearly enough about this, and it raises all sorts of very interesting questions about how the services are supplied, who supplies them, and a range of other questions. But everything we've been talking about so far has barely touched on the question of services. I mean, how does regulation, I mean, have you got any take on how regulation affects that part of the story? So anyone have any views on that? John?
I wouldn't claim to be a services expert, but I think you're right. I mean, part of it, we know that the services and bundled services is extremely important part. Extremely important part of the question of costs in global value chains. Just take, telecom services. There's a whole policy agenda in reform in telecom services. There's a whole agenda in regard to these standards issues. Take the information technology agreement. Way back when, there was quite a bit of energy, I think, in the private sector to try to move the ITA into the ITA 2 for tariff reduction, but also these non-tariff measures. And the services firms were just as active and just as vocal, I think, way back when, in arguing for extending the ITA into non-tariff measures. And so it's extremely important. I think it's the data question, and it's also sort of better understanding how these bundled services interact with the goods in the supply chain. I'm not sure any of us have a real clear picture, at least I don't.
That's right. At the firm level, I guess we're a services firm. We're doing some work with a client, pardon me, in China at the moment. It's an auto company, and we're actually helping them set up a lease finance business. And so the interplay of services and product here. And the complexity is market access, actually setting up the business. The complexity is attracting the right talent. There's some IP issues with many services firms around development, protection of that IP. And the interplay of services, it's a good example, because the interplay of services, if they can set that up, that'll actually allow them to sell more cars, because they'll help to finance those cars. So sometimes that interplay, you can think of services quite separately, or you can think of the interplay of services, and I'm sure, Anders, along your supply chain, you've probably got a whole bunch of services providers who are absolutely critical to getting the product through as well.
Yeah. Okay. If you look in the future for the telecommunication industry, I think Dale is correct here also. The future is, of course, working with the services and the software business, and the hardware, as we're talking about here for importing, will be more or less an enabler to get real big business in the future. So how to work with trade barriers on software and this kind of things is maybe also a question should be discussed.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think Dale mentioned very interesting things. I think I should correspond very closely with the work that we've been doing at FGI on services as well. Because the importance of services is not just, it's actually composed quite a significant share of manufacturing or like more traditional goods industry. But the fact that in the global value chains, when the production activities actually get increasingly modularized, the presence of services actually enable you to create new value by enabling you to create new bundles of goods of services. Like in the case of what Dale said, like if you actually improve the financing services, it allows you to sell more cars. Same thing with a number of capital good products. Actually providing good after-sales services is a big consideration for your buyers when they decide what to buy. If it's a product with a long running life. So I think services is going to become increasingly more important, and some of the basic services like transportation, logistics, utilities, I mean, you can't possibly get a competitive manufacturing or traditional goods industries in the absence of competitive services industry as well.
Patrick, sorry, just one more point. As developing economies start to add services, so the service sector starts to grow, say in China, the services sector will grow, the tiering will grow, and you'll get a lot more premium services at the higher end. And that's where the IP protection becomes really important. And so I think you know, you might think it's not so important at the moment, but I think if you look out 5 or 10 years, it becomes increasingly important when you get the tiering of different services levels.
Okay, let's go to the floor. From Pakistan, back there.
You know, when I got this invitation to come here, I came particularly because of this global value chain matter. And because, you know, where I'm located in Karachi, it has the access, and I know that people talk about it a lot, to Central Asia and the Far Eastern access and the Chinese access for Murumqi down there, and all of this is being talked about. I am also engaged with UNESCAP because I'm promoting the International Road Transport Union's TIR convention. So if I go one by one on all the issues here that were touched, like from Bain and Company, we really want to know what is the status of what they call the non-consignor status, which the World Customs Organization has been talking about in terms of trade facilitation. They call it the non-consignor status, or they call the, what is it called? The Approved Economic Operators, AEO status, which is supposed to be given by the WCO. The other thing is that for the World Bank, and people like the World Bank, I mean, you are very, you're of course dealing with the sovereigns, but your IFC arm deals with the private sector. Again, their threshold is very high, but we are at a lower threshold. There again, we are looking at border posts financing, but under United Nations conventions, because the volatility of certain regions, there's an issue of customs unions and so many other matters, and UNCTAD. So I wonder if I mean, I just wanted to know from, are you aware of these things? I know that Bali was trying to get a trade facilitation agreement. I mean, are these things going to happen independently, even if Bali doesn't get the trade facilitation agreement? Are these issues still going to move forward? And by the way, I have a Huawei ONU unit in my unit. Okay, I'm just telling you, optical network, CME-V4 direct.
Does anyone want to take that? I'm afraid that this is beyond my level of knowledge. But.
No.
Just one comment. On the issue of the trade facilitation agreement, I think it's fundamental. And the clock is still moving forward. There's time to reach that agreement. I think people have looked at that as a baseline. We're certainly aware of individual efforts, the IFC and other, UNESCAP, the WCO, these AEOs and other initiatives, but to have the baseline commitments at the WTO not to have been revised for over 50 years is, it really is telling if we can't come to that type of agreement. And that's the baseline for these other initiatives that you're mentioning that are supported at the country level, but it's really hard to argue sustained progress going forward without an agreement. People have talked about peeling that off into a plurilateral. There are other options out there, but there's still a day and a half and momentum going forward. So.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you completely about the importance of the trade facilitation agreement, but I think some of the things that you're referring to involving SCAP and WCO will have their own momentum and their own context. David, you.
Thank you. This is really a request to the panel for ammunition. I do a lot of work with APEC, as I mentioned before, and a lot of that is advocacy work, trying to essentially tell the story you're telling to persuade government officials that they need to move. In the many, APEC has, 75 different policy working groups, and working through all of those is a painstaking process, but you need ammunition. We rely almost entirely on the iPhone, iPad story done by ADBI back in, 2009. And it wearies me that that's the only anecdote, the only really empirically well broken down story that we can tell. I need more examples, and I need more examples in different sectors, because lots of people say, well, that's electronics, and they're in a different category. And I know that's not true, but without the ammunition, I can't advocate. I can't get these officials to move. It seems from what you said, John, that your report coming out in January might have some of that ammunition. In which case, please give me an advance copy, because we've got very urgent meetings. But also in the work that you're doing, Dale, it seems that you probably have anecdotes that would be immensely valuable in pursuing this case. So I just go out to you, Huawei's own supply chain. You're in the electronic sector already. So, I mean, you'd be just a replication of what we've seen from the iPhone. But if you've got examples in other sectors, I'd be very, very keen to see them so that we can then use those in the process of education and advocacy.
Can I just ask you examples of what exactly? Because when you mention iPhone and iPad, I immediately think of the sources of value and where value is added and on what. There's also the Nokia 95 case, but that's about it. And except for something we have done in FGI, we've got one in particular on a jacket. But is it to do with sources of value, or is it to do with these policy barriers that you're talking about?
Well, I think the policy barriers come deeply into this, because once you've broken the value chain down, then
you can do the
activity becomes transparent. I mean, we're not just looking at competitiveness, price competitiveness. We're looking to how services make up such a large proportion of production, which most people don't realize either. And as you come to quantify those services, so you discover the regulatory obstacles that are implicit there. So I think you just start to unpeel everything once you've got those chains to work on. So it's really...
Sure.
Sorry, Patrick, just to comment on that, David, just some sources of places to look. Obviously, there's a bunch of case studies in the 18 case studies in the report. We're going deeper on food and auto in the next version. On the flip side, obviously Singapore is a great place to do business with, going back, even back to 65 all the way through, and looking how they've got the turnaround time for ships in port down to 10 hours. In most other countries, it's days. I think that would be an interesting case study. One in the making, I had dinner quite recently with Idris Jala in Malaysia. I think that's a real success story coming through at the moment. It'd be great to think about that as a case study, because I think you both want firm level and governments really attacking these policies systematically. John, I'm sure you've got in some of the stuff you're talking about some great examples too.
Bilateral on that. Yeah.
Thank you. Some very interesting remarks, and thank you for your comments. One word that I think not one of you has mentioned that I think is a real issue, corruption.
Well, we've kind of mentioned it, but we're polite.
Well, let's be honest, and no, in many of these markets, it's widespread. And there's always the talk about, oh, we want to be serious, but there seems to be no real incentive. And when something takes longer to get through, it's because somebody hasn't maybe paid that bribe, or, have you done any work on what the corruption cost is in terms of trade?
We know that SMEs pay bribes and large companies pay fines, but beyond that...
Well, that's like saying a tax is a fine for doing something well, and a fine is a tax for doing something wrong.
It's just a question of how you make the transfer and what your constraints are. But no, these things are impossible to get at, because if you get information on them, it'll be the information that's given to you by somebody very much in confidence, but with the emphasizing that it's not them they're talking about. So, Transparency International, I haven't seen anything of theirs of late.
As HSBC, we use a transparency index.
Right.
And so we rate every single country in terms of transparency.
Yeah.
And we get down into that level as well now.
But you have to proxy for corruption. I don't think there's any way of getting at it directly. I just don't think the information would be available on a reliable and systematic basis.
If I may just want to add one thing you might want to think about. In the financial services sector, the focus, the pressure from the regulatory bodies, and I think it's the right thing to do, is in terms of knowing who we're doing business with, knowing who we're processing for and financing, is actually now, it's not know your customer. We have to know your customer's customer, know the customer's transparency.
Yeah.
And we get down into that level.
proxy, you have to proxy for corruption. I don't think there's any way of getting at it directly. I just don't think the information would be available on a reliable and systematic basis.
If I may just want to add one thing you might want to think about. In the financial services sector, the focus, the pressure from the regulatory bodies, and I think it's the right thing to do, is in terms of knowing who we're doing business with, knowing who we're processing for and financing, is actually now, it's not know your customer. We have to know your customer's customer, know the customer's suppliers, and know every single thing about them. And what that's done is added cost to the financial transaction and time. And financial crime compliance, anti-money laundering, sanctions compliant is at the top of every regulator's mind these days. It's going to put the cost into the financial aspects of the supply chain as well, and it's not going to go away.
I think that's absolutely right. Anyone else? Yeah.
Thanks the panelists for a very informative session. So I have a question about the recent multilateral initiatives regarding trade and investment. For example, TPP and TIPP. We were referring to the Doha round that's potentially going to make some progress in Bali, but I wonder whether our panelists have any thoughts on how this new round of multilateral initiatives that seem to exclude certain large countries in them, and how do you feel about the new development? Thank you.
I can just quickly answer that, and then we see if the panelists want to add. I mean, they're not really multilateral, they're essentially preferential. TPP and the TTIP, these are, and RCEP, of course, these are preferential. The TTIP and the TPP clearly aspire to go a lot further than the WTO has been able to go, as do some of the other regional or preferential agreements, including bilateral ones. So I think the problem for the multilateral trading system is that it gets left behind because of lowest common denominator politics. It's a complex story. I mean, there are lots of ways of trying to understand why the WTO hasn't been more effective in the 21st century. But there are, one of the things that wasn't mentioned in the last session, which I've always felt constrained about saying when I was working for the WTO, but a source of real concern, is that these agreements, which are putatively about trade, investment, and economic cooperation, are also non-trivially about geopolitics. And I think the more geopolitics there is in them, the less promising they will be as agreements for international economic cooperation. I don't know if any of you would like to add anything.
Just one word on that. Patrick, I think you're right. On the sort of the ambition in these. I had a briefing just recently on the TTIP negotiations on the regulatory side, and I admit I don't understand all of it, but I came away with the thought that in these issues of regulatory coherence, I think there are three dimensions to these negotiations, both sectorally and horizontally and vertically, and it's really a very, very far from the way the norms, ambition. I mean, very ambitious.
Yeah, I mean, for TTIP, they've been trying to, what they're planning to do there, they've been trying to do for very many years. It's to do with regulatory coherence. It's things like GMOs. It's things like growth hormones in meat. The divides are very, very sharp. The idea that you necessarily want harmonization, of course, and gets into all sorts of cultural, ethical questions. So, I mean, I don't think we can always aspire for perfect harmonization. And it'll be very interesting to see how quickly TTIP can actually address any of these things effectively. I'm not holding my breath. Any further questions, comments? If there are none, and the panel don't want to say anything, we've done very well because Catherine, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Dale very clearly outlined 4 kind of groups of obstacles, but there's a 5th one that Huawei has just had a serious experience of, and it's the perceived national interest issue getting in the way of trade. So that, for instance, Huawei has been blocked by the US government from selling their products into certain businesses in the US. And, you know, so for someone like Huawei, one of the solutions to that is more transparent governance about this company that is a great big private Chinese company. And so this will kind of prompt governance to actually try and overcome a trade barrier too. Do you have a comment on that?
It's not an SOE, right? I'm only kidding. If you want to.
Yeah. I mean, of course, we need to be more transparent company, Huawei, and we are working on that now to be very transparent. I'm here today, so the openness, and we're doing a lot of things to be a more transparent company. We are a private company and not a listed company yet, and probably not in the near future. But of course, we work with transparency to overcome some perceptions.
But Catherine's point is that it's a gratuitous barrier. Is that what you're saying? You're saying it's an unnecessary barrier.
Well, it's an unnecessary barrier, but it's been raised by lack of transparency. And so for this company, they're going to have to approach it in order to trade more. It must
There might also be a commanding heights argument.
I mean, the cost
Strategic.
to Huawei will be huge. I mean, what percentage cost of Huawei's trade? It must be worth 25% of your business to not be able to trade in that market.
But I don't want to talk too much about that issue. Of course, we are just a political statement. We work with transparency. We have some issues with some of the governments outside of China, and we are for perception reasons. But we are working with our transparency to meet these hindrances.
Now, like good supply chain managers, we've finished just in time for us to be able to get to where the bar is at the moment it opens. So with that, thank you all very much for being here, and thank the panel.
My personal